Welcome to Discover You, an inspiring podcast exploring cutting-edge solutions to our everyday psychological challenges. We explore complex mental health issues and talk to professionals, experts, and renowned authorities at the forefront of transformative healing. Our mission is to educate and destigmatize, and to ultimately view mental health as a proactive quest for optimized living and equilibrium, rather than mere crisis intervention. Welcome to another exciting episode of the Discover You podcast. Today we will be discussing a very important and controversial topic, the role of abstinence in addiction recovery. Joining us for this very exciting topic is our esteemed guest, Dr. Adi Jaffe. Adi Jaffe, who's a Ph.D. and a #1 best-selling author of The Abstinence Myth, is a nationally recognized expert on mental health, addiction, relationships, and shame. He's lectured in the UCLA Psychology department for the better part of a decade and was the executive director and co-founder of one of the most progressive mental health treatment facilities in the country until he started IGNTD. Dr. Jaffe, through IGNTD, is changing the way people think about and deal with mental health issues. His passion in the role of shame destroying lives is the philosophy behind IGNTD Recovery and its aim to greatly reduce the stigma of addiction and mental health. Welcome, Dr. Adi. We're so excited that you're joining with us today. And before we begin, absolutely, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your own struggles with addiction in the past, some of the challenges, the difficulties, and the consequences that you faced, and ultimately, how'd you get out of it?
Yeah, sure. So I come to this field like many of us do with actual personal experience. I started drinking at the age of 14, was drinking pretty regularly by the time I graduated high school. I'd added cannabis to that equation. And so by the time I went to college, I was drinking and smoking weed pretty much every day, all day. And it was just a social part of my life, is at least what I thought at the moment. But then I went through a bad breakup. And after that breakup, the wheels just came off. I was essentially not even going to school anymore. The way I was numbing my depression was drinking and smoking. I would wake up at 1, 2, 3 p.m., drink and smoke all day, pass out at 3 a.m. and repeat the cycle. I literally missed a final. I remember there was somebody that just passed by my dorm room as I'm sitting there taking shots. Said, "You weren't at the math final or calculus final." I said, "I didn't even know that there was a final. I wasn't there. I just disappeared." And that was just the beginning, right? After a while, alcohol and weed didn't quite do the job. And so I started experimenting with harder and harder drugs. I tried cocaine, MDMA, mushrooms, acid, which I had done before, but I was now relying on them pretty heavily. And that developed on and on. I moved out living upstate New York at the time. I ended up moving to California, to Los Angeles, to UCLA, where I finished school. And that's when I found meth. I was, after another breakup, stuck, unable to study. I hadn't really gone to class all quarter. And somebody said, "Hey, if you try some of this stuff, you'll be able to study all night." And they were right. With meth in my system, I could study for 3 days straight. I taught myself accounting. I taught myself math classes, literally not leaving a room and just studying for hours upon hours. That became part of my ritual. But by the time I graduated from UCLA, I was smoking meth all day. I would literally take a meth pipe with me to finals so I could go take bathroom breaks and smoke meth in the bathroom at UCLA. After school was over, I went into drug dealing. I was using a lot of drugs and it was costing a lot of money. So I started selling some of those drugs. And within a year or two, that was my full-time job. I came out to LA for school and music, but really what I was doing was just using drugs all day and just kind of making music between 2 and 5 a.m. when there was nobody else around. And it just got really, really dark, really bad. Everything that happens in the drug dealing world happened to me. So I got robbed. I got held up at gunpoint, which meant I bought guns because that made sense to me. And, next thing you know, my life was kind of like another version of Scarface. Just with, I guess, less quality photography, right? It just looked ugly all the time. It looked really, really ugly, but I didn't know how to get out of it. I was making my living doing it. I was functioning psychologically because of it. I needed drugs to get up. That was my meth. And then when I needed to go to sleep, I would take GHB or Xanax and fall asleep. And that was the cycle I was living in. When I wanted to party with friends, I would do ecstasy. And then, maybe sometimes we would do mushrooms or for 5-6 years, I just wasn't conscious ever. And the way it ended was actually with an arrest. I'd been arrested a couple of times, but this one was a big one. I'd gotten in a motorcycle accident, had about a half a pound of cocaine in my lining of the jacket. I'd been out delivering, and so I delivered some of the rest of it, but still a good quantity was left on me. The cops found it in the jacket, arrested me even in a hospital. I woke up with like this poster on my chest saying that I'd been arrested, but they knew I couldn't get up, so they let me go there. I had to go to surgery, fix my leg. I was in a wheelchair, and then the cops came kind of constantly trying to get me to snitch on people above me because they figured anybody with a half a pound of cocaine in their jacket knows somebody. I wouldn't do it, and 3 months later, they came into my house in a full SWAT team arrest in Brentwood on a Saturday at 8 o'clock in the morning. And, that was the beginning of the end of my drug use career. But it still took me a little while to figure out how to get things right. And to be honest, that was a process that took about 3 to 5 years before I perfected it. And it's through that journey that I went through myself that I ended up initially accessing what is typical addiction treatment and then kind of developing my own ideas about it. I ended up going back to school, et cetera. And we can talk about the rest.
Wow, that is quite a story. And it's a fascinating story. I'd love to unpack some of it more, in a few moments. But before we even continue, you wrote a book, and it's a very popular book, and it's innovative book. It's every once in a while a book like that comes around, and it disrupts normative, conventional thinking. The name is pretty self-explanatory, The Abstinence Myth, and you basically seem to argue that there's something wrong with the notion of total abstinence in addiction treatment. Can you expound on that for a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been incredibly happy and humble and grateful for the success. We've sold over 10,000 copies between Amazon and on our own website, and people are loving it. And, the book, as you mentioned, the book is called The Abstinence Myth, but it's actually not that I have a problem with abstinence per se. What I talk about is the abstinence myth. There are two pieces to it. And the first one is that abstinence is the thing that fixes addiction. We seem to believe that in order for people to be serious about getting help for addiction, they need to be able to commit to abstinence. Like if you're not ready for abstinence, you're not serious about getting help. I did a study when I was a postdoc right after getting my Ph.D. at UCLA. And what bothered me was I was looking at why are people not going to get help? A lot of people may know this, but some of you may not know this listening right now. Only 10% of the people who meet criteria for addiction itself actually get professional treatment. That doesn't happen in any other field. In depression and diabetes and cancer, the rates are something between 60, 70, and 90% of people get help. In addiction, it's 10%. And so I said, well, let me understand why that is. And there were some studies from the 80s and 90s, but nothing was done for years. So I decided to follow up on it. And we found 4 main reasons why people were not going into treatment. One of them is obvious: cost. Treatment can be really expensive. The second one is still pretty obvious, although sometimes people believe that logistics, right, the actual things you have to do to get treatment, which are really complicated actually, logistics were a problem. People think, well, if you're not committed, if you can't really leave for 30, 60, 90 days, or if you can't commit to outpatient treatment 10, 15 hours a week, you're not serious about it. People have lives and they need to be able to maintain those. So cost, logistics. Then shame, and that's something huge that I work on and we'll probably talk about. The shame of going to tell people that you are struggling and have lost control in your life holds 50 to 60% of people from even looking for help. And the same thing for abstinence. About 50 to 60% of our participants said, I don't want to be struggling like this anymore, but I enjoy drinking or using, or I'm not ready to quit. When I presented that research to a lot of people, they said, well, those people aren't serious about getting help. They know they're struggling, but they still want to use. And I said, what if there's another explanation? What if they do want help, they're just not ready to quit? And we have created an entire system that doesn't even allow them to think that way. So what we're essentially saying in the addiction treatment field is this: if you are not ready to quit, you're not serious about getting help, so we won't help you. Again, no other field does this. Imagine for a second that you went to get cancer treatment, for instance. So let's say it was even lung cancer, and you smoke. Could you imagine a doctor not being willing to give you treatment for your cancer because you still smoke? Or I'll make it even more insane for you: depression. Imagine you went to a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a physician, and said, hey, I'm feeling really depressed. I want some help. Do you have anything for me? And you go, yeah, I absolutely do. I just need you to commit to not being depressed anymore. And let's say that person even does that? Like, what sort of an ask is that on the front end? How about you give me help first, and then we'll see if I can not be depressed anymore? I think the same thing has to start applying in addiction. Let's be clear. People are not only drinking because of alcohol. People are drinking because they're using alcohol to overcome things in their life. Asking them to take away their medicine without first offering some help seems pretty unethical to me as far as I'm concerned. So that's number one myth. The idea that you have to be willing to commit to abstinence to show that you're serious about recovery. The second one is I believe we have to stop measuring how well somebody is doing in recovery by their rate of abstinence. What is the one way you find out how well somebody is doing in recovery? Let's see, like what would be the number one thing you would ask somebody?
Right. So typically the time of sobriety is utilized to measure the strength of it.
Yeah. So you'd say, how much time do you have?
The abstinence, right.
So how much time you have? Let's think about that for a second. That means that the number one predictor that we believe predicts somebody's recovery, overall recovery, is not just the amount, but the consecutive days of recovery that somebody has. That's the one number that we've decided to rely on. I think that's a huge mistake for a couple of reasons. First of all, and the one most important to me, is there are people who are having a hard time achieving 90, 180, 365 days of consecutive recovery, consecutive abstinence, but are actually doing much, much better than they used to do a year ago, 2 years ago. There's no way to measure that the way we currently measure it. You still might only have 8 days, but you may only be drinking every 8 days now, whereas a year ago you were drinking every day. That's a huge success. It's not identified at all in our field right now. So that's actually based on abstinence rates. So in my programs and on the podcast and in my book, I recommend other ways of measuring it as well. But then let's go one level beyond it. I know a lot of people who have 3-4 years sober, abstinent from their drug of choice, and are completely miserable in their life. And yet I know people who are still struggling to meet complete abstinence, but their quality of life, their relationships, their career, their money situation, their romance, their life with their children is vastly improved. And yet they get no credit for improved recovery because they can't meet the 365-day of continued abstinence goal. So I think we have to stop putting abstinence at the front end of recovery. And I think we have to stop making abstinence the only measure of recovery that we use on the back end. If we can do those two things, here's what will happen. First of all, more people will be willing to get help. And we are all constantly fighting with each other about what is the best way to help somebody. How about the fact that the best way to help somebody is to get them into help? So if we know that 50, 60% of people want help but are not ready to quit, I think we need to find more ways to get those people in. Why? Because that doubles how many people we're helping already. That's number one. Secondly, there's a fight about what is the most successful kind of treatment. But we're measuring success with a singular variable. Consecutive days abstinence. I believe that we will end up finding that there are a lot of techniques that are not great at making somebody meet longer consecutive abstinence days, but are actually incredibly good at elevating the quality of life. We're just not paying attention to that right now. So that's what the abstinence myth about. It's about getting people to understand that abstinence is not actually the goal of recovery. A better life is the goal of recovery. And so what you need to do is understand, why is somebody drinking or using or whatever it is that they're doing? Go solve those problems for them, and then recovery comes on the heels of that.
Very, very interesting and thought-provoking. I want to just pause for a moment and tell you a little bit about our experiences in treating clients at Renewal Health Group, where we have really detected certain distinctive 3 areas of categorization of different causations in addiction. Because ultimately, when you're talking about recovery, humanity, we're so different, and every human being is a world unto themselves, and the causations and the specific variables that go into each and every one's story really presents distinctive nuance that has to be addressed in the treatment, in the recovery. We have found, broadly speaking, that there are intrinsic addicts, and these are just terms that we've developed here, circumstantial addicts, and then addicts who just simply have unresolved mental health issues. So the unresolved mental health might be the easiest to start with, where they have a lot of pain, whether it's physical, psychological, and they're not necessarily getting the proper treatment for their mental health issues. So seeking mind-altering relief makes a drug very appealing. Get them the mental health. Get them the mental health intervention and treatment. You will alleviate a lot of the root cause. The circumstantial addict is also, something that we encounter very often and is easy to relate to. It's similar to a little bit of the story that you were describing, drinking from a young age, in college, not necessarily motivated with clarity of mission and purpose, and numbing feelings, and just, the addiction feeds itself. So the initial causation could have been circumstances, and then it takes on a life of itself, and it could lead to selling and everything that lifestyle brings along with it.
Sure.
But I feel like the unique category that is often misunderstood in society is the intrinsic addict. And the intrinsic addict might only start using when they're a teenager, when they're 12, when they're 20. But from their earliest childhood memories, they always felt different. They felt a void. And even though when they're using and when they're chasing this mind-altering relief, it doesn't seem like they're trying to get rid of a spiritual deficiency, but ultimately they are possessed with a unique sensitivity to a hyper meaning and purpose infused lifestyle. And when they don't have that, they feel that deficiency much more than a normie, than somebody who has no struggle with mind-altering substances. And that's where spiritual programs come into the play. So we have these different categories, and I think it's very evident for anybody who knows a lot about addiction, who's in the community, and you see there's really a lot of these distinctive different types, and sometimes there's overlap. It's not like they're mutually exclusive. Yeah. So my question to you would be, first of all, do you identify with anything that I've just said? And if you do, a lot of the points that you're making about, the obsessive nature that abstinence plays a role in the arena of recovery, that we only want to afford you the help and get you the help if you're committing to abstinence. Would you say that a lot of the content that you're communicating and passionate about is relevant in all three categories? Would you make any type of distinctions? Would you make any exceptions, any nuance? What would you say to that?
I love it. So first of all, yes, I absolutely do identify. I talk about how when I was 14 years old, the reason I started drinking was because I felt socially anxious since I was 8. I never felt like I measured up. The way I talk to people in my programs about this is a lot of the people who struggle with addiction that I deal with and I work with regularly have this insane, intense need for perfectionism, and yet they never meet their own standards. And that's where that piece of the intrinsic category that you just mentioned is, and I relate to that fully. So as long as we allow for overlap, I love the categorization. We have it slightly differently, and this will make sense for anybody who's done a biopsychosocial assessment, but biology, psychology, environment, and spirituality are the 4 factors we talk about at Ignited. And what I always tell people is nobody has only one. It's always an enmeshment of multiple factors from each one of those 4. And so, again, like if you take those 3 categories that you had and you overlap them, you create actually a pretty wide variety of different people that, yes, maybe broadly fit into 3 main categories. We could have somebody who's intrinsic and has unresolved mental health issues. By the way, what are mental health issues, right? Some of them are biological in nature and some of them are psychological in nature, trauma-based, early childhood experience, attachment, et cetera. And the same thing about the extrinsic, right? So you can have somebody who's got intrinsic issues, but then never has the external impact. So that's the environmental factor in our piece. And then they won't get exposed to drugs and alcohol. So what they will do is they'll become workaholics or they'll become risk takers or whatever that is. So yes, I absolutely agree. And I actually think that the important thing about this delineation is the following. Here's a mistake we make regularly in our current approach. Somebody walks into the rooms, and I'm going to use AA and 12-step groups as the standard because they are the standard. 80-85% of treatment is based on 12-step. The vast majority of attendance in self-help group is based on 12 steps. So I'm going to talk about it because that's the standard that we need to compare to because that's what exists out there. But when somebody walks into a room, when I walk into a room, and when hundreds of the people that I've worked with walk into a room, what they hear is this: how you got here doesn't matter. You're an alcoholic. You didn't know you were an alcoholic, but now we're giving you the term. And now that you know that you're an alcoholic, none of that stuff before matters. You have this obsession of the mind. You're powerless. As long as you give up power and you follow these steps, everything will work. Here's what's missing. There is no triage. There's no categorization. Now, maybe my problem when I was dealing meth and smoking meth all day was one of those environmental pressure ones. But Nobody knew that, and nobody said to me that in the day, right? I'd been drinking since I was 14. By the time I was 25, 26, I was smoking meth all day. I was a quote unquote addict. And that meant I just fit in the bucket with other people who were addicts. What we need to get much, much better at is this nuance. Will we find the perfect triage? I don't know. It seems like, different ones of us have different ways of separating out people. The thing is that we're really, really pretty terrible at separating people out on the front end. What does that mean? Think about it, right? If I need to get to know you really, really well before I can even understand which of the 3 categories that you described you belong to, or what mix of those, or which of the 4 that I described in the mix of those, I can't demand of you to be willing to accept abstinence for the rest of your life, even as your goal. If what I'm saying is, once I talk to you, I'm going to split you up into 3 or 4 or one of 12 groups. And some of those groups, right, like what you're saying is the mental health primary group and the extrinsic group, they may not be what people are calling addicts typically. So why are we putting them all into the same funnel? Why are we bringing them all into the same endpoint and demanding the same thing from them? Doesn't it make a million times more sense to say, hey, look, you don't have to commit to anything but coming in. Come in, we'll do the assessments, we'll get to know you for a few weeks. You do whatever feels right in the moment for you. Obviously, we hope you drink or use less and quit, but come on in. Let's do some work. Let us help you figure out which of these groups you belong to, and then we can assess goals. That's the opposite of what we do right now. And then we wonder why 90% of people aren't willing to get help, even if it's an even distribution in your 3 groups. I don't believe it is. I believe that there are only a very small subset, like 5 to 10% of people who are those chronic, ongoing, relapsing problem drinkers that will have a problem for the rest of their life and have to meet abstinence. I think it's a very small group. But let's say it is an equal distribution between your 3 groups. That means 66% of the people who struggle with drugs and alcohol are not the classic addict and an alcoholic. And yet what happens when they present with drug and alcohol problems? They are told to walk through the exact same path, do the exact same thing as the other category, which leaves them wanting because they're not actually getting the help they need. So they leave, and now we blame them for it, right? Passages like how it works, etc. We blame them for it. Why? Because they didn't want badly enough, or they can't be honest with themselves. I think that's a terrible, terrible way to operate our system.
I hear that, and that I definitely, in my estimation as well, the idea of a one-size-fits-all, or even assuming that the categories are equally represented in the population and demographic, is not necessarily something that is accurate or supported by the data. But I guess what my question to you would be, and perhaps what some critics might be asking, is, since the stakes are so incredibly high, with a relapse potentially spelling the termination of a romantic relationship, a family being destroyed, a career, a job, and sometimes life itself, with fentanyl being laced on some of the hard drugs on the streets. Why should we not err on the side of caution? And why should we feel, conceptually be okay with...
So I'm just taking some notes.
Sure. So why should we conceptually be okay with abstinence not being the total goal, if the stakes are really so high?
If 90% of people are not getting the help, then I would argue that what we're doing is the opposite of what you're saying. We're actually excluding 9 out of 10 people who need our help. We're telling them, unless you're willing to come to our side, you don't get our help. So what we're doing is actually excluding more people. We are creating the harm. If we said to them, hey, come on in, let's do whatever you're willing to do right now, and twice as many people, forget even the other 90%, maybe 30 or 40% more people come in, haven't we served those people better? Haven't we served more people? And haven't we just created less harm overall among people who struggle with addiction? Here's the problem. In our search to be safe with as many people as possible, we've excluded almost everybody from participating in the system, which means a tiny sliver of people is safe while everybody else is practicing without any protection, without any boundaries, without any help. So that's number one. I think we've got it flipped. Secondly is this. The evidence that what we're doing is failing is simple. You don't have to go far and deep into the data. We have been maintaining records on overdose deaths in this country and acute deaths specifically related to acute intoxication. I'm not talking about long-term loss of life. That is insane data. I'm looking at the really clear data. You know what happens? Every 10 years, we double the rate of overdose. Double it. The population doesn't double every 10 years in this country. The rate of overdose does. What does that tell us? We are killing more and more people every single decade, twice as many people every decade. And so I totally understand the need for safety. Actually, I believe strongly in the need for safety. What I'm saying is, by demanding that version of safety from people, we are actually exacerbating the problem. And again, I'll just give you a really clean example. If when you went to a doctor with a broken leg and you're walking in on crutches, the doctor said to you, look, I'll work on your leg, but you can't use crutches coming to my office. You got to hobble over here on one leg or crawl or whatever you can do. I don't accept patients that walk in with a crutch. Do you think more people would come in for care on their leg, or more people would let their leg just heal at home alone? I think more people would stay at home.
I hear that. So that's a great point you're bringing up, and I want to just respond with two quick follow-ups to that. So the first one I would say is, I'm not sure about the numbers in terms of, is the intrinsic addict more populous than the other categories, or less populous? Is it 10% or is it 9%? But wouldn't you say that by promoting abstinence as not necessarily being a primal focus or priority in recovery, that we would essentially be guilty of the same thing in the opposite direction, in which we're ultimately giving a broad strokes categorization and classification to something which is at its core fundamentally nuanced and really does require a much more in-depth level of diagnostics before we even really give it a lot of the details and a lot of the specifications. It's almost like, there you have general doctors, general practitioners, and then you have specialists. Addiction is really a specialty area that until somebody goes in for a deep diagnostic, it's kind of hard to figure out what the intervention should look like and how the aftercare should look like. And absence that level of in-depth analysis and diagnostics, it just seems wrong to paint anybody and box anybody in.
Absolutely. So two things that I want to talk about. First of all, given that is true, I believe, just my belief, is that the goal should be to get as many people to the analysis and testing and assessment portion as possible, not to erect massive hurdles that will only allow a small number of people to get to that place. And whether we like it or not, we can have whatever judgment we want on it. I have no problem with abstinence. We can have whatever judgment we want on it. But if we know for a fact that a lot of people are not getting assessed, are not coming in to get really checked out, are not committing to getting help because of a hurdle, and we know that we need to get them to that assessment, the quizzing, the observation, the testing component, to understand how to help them, wouldn't we just break down that wall in order to help more people get to that portion, and then worry at the next phase in terms of how to triage them appropriately? That's the first piece to the first that you mentioned. And secondly, here's something that I found in my actual work. About 40% of people still come to me for abstinence, by the way. They come in wanting abstinence. They just don't want the shame-based stick approach of abstinence they get in other places. But here's what I've noticed that I love. Something around 40 to 50% of the people, we're running data on this right now, I don't have hard data on it, but about 40 to 50% of the people who actually come to reduce experience substantial reductions, like 50, 60, 80% reductions in their use. And then some of them decide to abstain on their own. Why? Because when they realize what drinking without a problem looks like in their life, they decide that's not the kind of drinking I want to do. I don't want to have a drink with dinner. That doesn't satisfy me. I just feel tired after. I want to go to sleep. The next day I'm a little groggy and weird. They decide to give it up. Now here's the beauty of that. And it's something that we miss. We think we can make people abstain. It's proving itself to be false. It doesn't work. If we allow them in, they get to then select goals. And yes, of course, some of them will choose moderation when in reality, abstinence will be much better for them. But first of all, they're choosing a goal. The odds of them selecting and working towards that goal are much, much greater than if you force them into something they don't want at all and they just leave. So two different pieces. The first one, and I agree with you, if we need to understand a person better in order to know if they need abstinence or not, I think it's silly to require abstinence of everybody who comes into that point, because let's get them to the assessment. And the second piece, I have zero problem with abstinence. In my book, I literally say abstinence is a very worthwhile goal. It just shouldn't be the thing that we put on the front as like the gatekeeper to addiction help.
So you hear that, and I totally hear that. I guess my question would be, imagine today everybody's into juices. Everybody's into health. Everybody's into, being very conscious of what we put into our bodies. And every year, right around New Year's, we all hear about everybody saying, you know what, I put on so much weight. It's COVID. I've been at home. I've just been going from back to the kitchen to my home office, back to the kitchen, snacking at all hours of the night. I need to go on a juice diet. I need to go on a cleansing period of whether it's 2 days, 48, 72 hours, 1 week. And then I'll go back after I lose my 10, 15 pounds, I'll be able to moderate my food consumption. Slightly different, maybe very different, but somewhat analogous. Folks come to inpatient treatment. Inpatient treatment still today, the data consistently shows that folks who go to inpatient rehab, the chances of them recovering and the chances of them being able to exhibit enduring sobriety, having paradigm shifts, undergo a lot of the clinical and psychiatric intervention as well, is, their chances are enormously increased. When we talk about inpatient treatment, when we talk about any initial phase, I think most folks, if not all, would agree that you have to have total abstinence in that 30-day period of time, or 60 or 90. So my question is, you're obviously taking a much more open-minded approach and really, taking a lot of factors and components that the narrow treatment world right now is not allowing into the discourse and into the equation. But are you suggesting that even at that early phase of 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, total abstinence should not be a prerequisite, should not be a critical part of that process? Because ultimately, if you are suggesting that, I would love to know the data and the research on that. But, it would almost seem like, the addict, or while somebody is in the throes of addiction, even if that's not going to be their identification, but while they're in the throes of it and they have that moral fog, just that chaos, that cloud of reckless, irrational behavior, They won't be capable to self-regulate and moderate at that point until they're really better. So
I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story if I can, because a lot of people have a similar slant to what you're talking about right now, which is, look, this might work really, really well for the housewife who drinks like a couple of extra glasses of wine at night, but it's not for the true addict and alcoholic who are in the middle of the throes. So I want to share with you, and this is two public stories, but I'll share the more egregious one because I think it'll make sense of what we're talking about here. One of my favorite success stories at Ignited is a woman by the name of Aaliyah. She's been on the podcast. She was just on our podcast a couple of weeks ago, and she's done a video testimonial for us. Just like myself, a daily meth user by the time she found Ignited. She had been to multiple rehabs. Her sister is actually a psychiatrist specializing in addiction. So over a period of 5-6 years, she did everything she could to try to help her. Aaliyah tried to commit suicide. She had taken a gun, held it in her mouth, and tried to shoot it, and it jammed, and it didn't work. And so she got in her car, and she didn't have a seatbelt on. She decided to drive really, really fast on the freeway and try to hit something and try to die that way because the gun didn't work for her. I don't know how, serendipity, divine intervention, call it whatever you want, but she heard me on the radio talking about the abstinence myth. She pulled the car over on the side, called her sister and said, I think I found somebody who speaks my language. I want to try this thing out. At the time, our program cost $1,000. Now, don't forget cost, because you talked about inpatient treatment. I'm going to get to that in a second. The vast majority of treatment doesn't happen in inpatient. So I think that's an important thing to understand. Somewhere between 10 to 20% of people go inpatient. The vast majority happens outside in therapy offices or outpatient. So that's important to keep. The cost is massive. We were $1,000, which was much more expensive than we are right now. So she needed help from her sister to get into it. She had been using meth for about 15 to 20 years, I believe, or at least hard drugs for about 15 to 20 years. Massive criminal involvement. It was an insane story. Lost her daughters. Her daughter called the cops on her, got emancipated. She came to Ignited, no requirement to abstain, nothing like that. Just started participating and was having a hard time, like a lot of people have in the beginning. She would stop, then restart, stop, then restart. Every time she came in, we just welcomed her back in and talked and through the stressors that were going on, and there were many of them in her life. And then one day she told me the story. She told me the story about 2-3 weeks after the event happened. But she told me she was on a run. She was out for about a week, but she loved our group so much because they were non-judgmental. Whenever she talked, we celebrated her instead of judging her for not meeting abstinence goals and taking her back. Here's your 0-day chips again. So she was listening at her dealer's house while waiting for the drugs. She was listening to our group. I was the only one running groups at the time. Headphones in, tuning in. And I told a story and I was using an example that connected with her in the moment. And what I said was this, and it relates to what you just mentioned. I said, I talk to a lot of people who think they're done. They've ruined their life too much. They've screwed up too many times. They've failed too many people and disappointed too many people. Nobody's in their side. Nobody's in their corner. Nobody's ever going to help them. They have no way out. This is the life that they're doomed to live now. Hopelessness, like true hopelessness. And what I said is what they forget is they're driving a car and their hands are on the wheel, fixated on the wheel, and they're going full steam ahead, like gas pedal down, about to get off a cliff. And it seems to them like falling off the cliff is inevitable. I'm going too fast. I can't do anything. I'm going to die. And they forget that at any moment, they can just turn the wheel, right? Really hard turn to the wheel. Whatever that means in the moment for you can just turn the wheel and go the other way. Now think about the actual story, the analogy. If you're on a cliff, that doesn't sound comfortable. You're either hitting the mountain or you're rolling your car, but at least you're not going straight into that cliff. And you know what Aaliyah did in that moment? She heard it. She turned to her friend. Her friend was listening in on the same call. And she said, let's just get out of here. She turned the freaking wheel. She just left. She had no plan beyond that moment, but she just left because it resonated. She didn't want to go the way she was going, so she did something different. You know what came out of that Tuesday 1 p.m. group? Aaliyah went back, got sober again. She's been sober for 2 years since that time. Her friend, who was sitting right next to her, had also been going off a cliff. She was running away from a jail sentence. She had to turn herself into the police, and she'd been running away from it, using to forget how terrible her life had gotten during her criminal activity and drug use. You know what she did? The next week, she turned herself into the police. She had to serve a year in jail. When she got out, she got her life back together. She's been sober for 1.5 years since that time. So let me ask you a question. In a story like Aaliyah's, would I have been better to say to her in the beginning, hey, Aaliyah, we can't help you in this program anymore. You said you wanted to quit meth and you keep relapsing. Come back when you have 30 days sober and I'll be here for you? Or is it better to say, you know what, come as you are, listen when you can, commit to trying to get better, and I will help you to the best of my ability to turn that wheel? I believe firmly that the more people we get to engage, the bigger the barriers that are removed, then we will get rid of more and more and more. And of course, there are safety issues. I had a client yesterday who was drinking and then told one of our coaches, we don't do treatment, it's all education and coaching, told one of our coaches that she's drinking and driving. This is all remote. Nobody's next to her. What do? Do you call the cops on her in the middle of nowhere to try to get her arrested? Do you walk her through on the phone? I'm not saying these are easy decisions to make, but Aaliyah's story and the stories that I've seen hundreds of times tell me the same thing. What people want is somebody to hold their hand and guide them to the right place, not beat them over the head and try to drag them over there. And so I'm not saying it's comfortable. It's just hard work. But what I've seen is we get the people who have not been succeeding in other places, not rehab, not outpatient treatment, not therapy, not AA, and they find a place that doesn't judge them for their mishaps, their slip-ups, their failures. And through repeated exposures, I literally recorded a podcast on this for our next Friday, they're able to find what they need.
That's beautiful. And you know what? The recovery community and all the many millions of addicts across America are lucky that IGNTD does exist and are lucky that there is such a philosophy out there. And I really commend you. And you know what? At the end of the day, every additional group, philosophy, organization, especially one that's a disruptor, that has a fresh, innovative way of approaching things, regardless of detractors, regardless of whether people agree or is controversial or not. You're saving lives and you're in the trenches and you're doing great work. Keep it up, Adi. It's been so nice having you on the program and insightful and stimulating. And honestly, you're saving the world one life at a time. Keep up the amazing work. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, man. Thank you. And thank you for being open to having this conversation. I think I want to reiterate what you just said. I don't think there's one way. I think there are 60 to 70 million people struggling with drugs and alcohol in this country, if not more, at any given year. And the more options we give them, like a menu, the more likely it is that one of them will find something that speaks to them. And somebody may hear these three, the three categorization model that you mentioned, the intrinsic, extrinsic, and the unhandled mental health issues, and go, oh my God, that totally described me. I am one of the people in these categories. And then it'll make sense to them. And all we need is to help people find the right approach for them. And then we'll save more lives altogether.
Absolutely. Keep up the amazing work. And I'm looking forward to listening to some more of your content featured on your podcast. And
Thank you so much.
Wishing everyone else out there a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you for joining in to another insightful and exciting episode of Discover You podcast. Take care.